March 1945. The sky over Berlin burned with tracer fire and searchlight beams that carved through the darkness like ghostly fingers searching for prey. Inside the belly of a B-17 flying fortress named Lucky 7, 23-year-old navigator Lieutenant James Mitchell felt anything but lucky as he watched hydraulic fluid spray across the instrument panel like arterial blood. The mission had started like any other. Briefing at 0400 hours, cold coffee that tasted like motor oil, and the same nervous jokes the crew always made before climbing into their aluminum coffin. Mitchell had plotted their course to the Tempelhof railway yards with the precision that had earned him commendations from his superiors. He'd marked every flak battery position, every known fighter base, every landmark that would guide them home through the smoke and chaos of war-torn Germany. But now, as Captain Robert Hayes fought to keep the bomber level after direct flak hit their hydraulic system, all those careful calculations meant nothing. The plane shuddered violently, metal screaming against metal, and Mitchell knew with cold certainty that they were in serious trouble. If you're finding this story compelling, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more incredible true stories from history that deserve to be remembered. Hayes's voice crackled through the intercom, steady despite the circumstances. "Hydraulics are gone, fellas. We've got no way to lower the landing gear electrically." There was a pause, heavy with implications. "Mitchell, I need you to get to the manual crank. It's going to be a long ride home." Mitchell unbuckled from his navigator's station, his hands already aching at the thought of what lay ahead. The manual landing gear crank was located in the radio room, a cramped space behind the bomb bay where the temperature hovered just above freezing even on good days. The mechanism was designed as a last resort, something you'd use for maybe 15 minutes in an emergency. Nobody had ever considered what would happen if you needed to crank for 3 hours straight, while enemy fighters prowled the skies and flak bursts rocked the aircraft like a ship in a storm. The navigator squeezed past Bombardier Danny Sullivan, who gave him a grim thumbs up. Sullivan had been the one to spot the flak battery that got them, had watched the shell explode just beneath their No. 3 engine. The kid from Brooklyn still had blood on his flight suit from shrapnel that had torn through the plexiglass nose, though he swore it wasn't his. In the radio room, Staff Sergeant Marcus Webb moved aside to give Mitchell access to the crank. Webb's face was pale, his usually steady hands trembling slightly as he maintained radio contact with the other bombers in their formation. They were alone now, separated from the group by the damage and the evasive maneuvers Hayes had thrown them into when the flak hit. The crank itself was a simple T-shaped handle connected to a gear system that manually lowered the main landing gear. On paper, it was straightforward. In reality, as Mitchell gripped the cold metal and gave his first turn, he felt resistance that made his shoulders burn immediately. This wasn't going to be 15 minutes. This was going to be torture. Mitchell began to crank, one rotation at a time. The mechanism fought him with every turn, gears grinding and cables squealing as they slowly, painfully extended the landing gear. His breath came in clouds of vapor in the freezing air, each exhale a white ghost that dissipated as quickly as his strength. Outside, the sky over Berlin continued its deadly light show. Mitchell could hear the muffled thump of flak bursts, feel them shake the aircraft's frame. Hayes was taking them higher, trying to climb above the worst of the anti-aircraft fire, but every change in altitude made Mitchell's job harder as the pressure differential affected the gear mechanism. 20 minutes in, Mitchell's arms felt like they were filled with molten lead. His palms, despite his thick gloves, were developing blisters that burned with each rotation. Webb watched him with growing concern, occasionally offering water from a canteen that Mitchell couldn't accept because stopping meant losing what little progress he'd made. The intercom crackled. "We've got company, boys. 2 Me-109s at 3 o'clock high." That was waist gunner Tommy Kowalski, his voice tight with adrenaline. The rattle of machine gun fire filled the aircraft, spent shell casings raining down like brass hail. Mitchell kept cranking. There was nothing else to do. If the German fighters got them, it wouldn't matter whether the landing gear was down or up. If they survived the fighters, they'd need those wheels down or they'd die anyway in a crash landing. So he cranked, his world narrowing to the circular motion of his arms, the burn in his muscles, the grinding of gears. The B-17 lurched violently as Hayes threw them into a dive, trying to shake the fighters. Mitchell slammed against the bulkhead, the crank handle striking his ribs hard enough to make him gasp. But he didn't let go. He couldn't let go. He found his grip again and kept turning, even as tracer rounds stitched past their tail section, even as the aircraft rolled and pitched like a carnival ride designed by a madman. Webb's voice cut through the chaos. "They're breaking off. Temperature gauge on number 2 is climbing, though, Skipper," Hayes responded immediately. "Feather number 2. Mitchell, how we doing on that gear?" Mitchell tried to answer, but his throat was too dry. He managed a thumbs up that Webb relayed over the intercom. In truth, he had no idea how much progress he'd made. The gear indicator in the cockpit would tell Hayes when the wheels were locked down, but back here in the radio room, Mitchell was operating blind. All he could do was keep cranking and trust that each rotation meant something. 45 minutes now. Mitchell's vision was starting to blur at the edges. The cold and the exertion were a dangerous combination. His core temperature was dropping even as his muscles screamed with heat and fatigue. Sweat soaked through his flight suit, only to freeze in the sub-zero air. His fingers were going numb despite the constant motion. Webb saw him faltering. The radio operator set down his headset and moved closer. "Let me take over for a bit, Lieutenant." Mitchell shook his head, gasping for air. "Can't stop. Lose the tension in the cables." It was true, though barely. What was also true was that Mitchell couldn't bring himself to pass this burden to someone else. This was his responsibility now, his cross to bear. The crew was depending on him. The sergeant nodded slowly, understanding something unspoken passing between them. Instead, Webb positioned himself behind Mitchell, bracing the navigator's back with his own body, lending what support he could. It helped. The extra stability meant Mitchell could focus entirely on the cranking motion instead of fighting to stay upright as the aircraft continued its brutal journey home. Over the next hour, the story of Mitchell's struggle spread through the intercom. Each crew member checked in, offering encouragement that the navigator barely registered through his exhaustion. Sullivan in the nose, the Kowalski brothers in the waist, tail gunner Eddie Sanchez, engineer Bill Morrison up in the top turret. They were all fighting their own battles. Sullivan was manually operating the bomb bay doors that had stuck partially open after the flak hit. The young bombardier from Brooklyn lay on his stomach in the freezing nose section, reaching through a narrow maintenance panel to work the manual release cables. Every gust of wind through the damaged plexiglass threatened to pull him out into the void. His hands were numb, his face cut and bleeding from the shrapnel that had torn through their position. But he kept working, because those doors created devastating drag that made Hayes's job of keeping them airborne nearly impossible. Morrison, the flight engineer, had his own crisis in the top turret. The number 2 engine was running hot, temperature gauges climbing into the red zone despite feathering the propeller. He could see oil streaming from a punctured line, could smell the acrid scent of overheating metal that preceded fire. With methodical precision, born of countless training hours, he worked through emergency procedures, adjusting mixture settings, monitoring temperatures, ready to activate the fire suppression system the instant flames appeared. Every second the engine didn't catch fire was a small miracle he worked to extend. The Kowalski brothers, Tommy and Frank, stood at their waistgun positions with grim determination. They'd burned through most of their ammunition during the fighter attack, and now they carefully rationed what remained. Tommy, the elder by 18 months, kept scanning the sky for more German fighters, while Frank inventoried their remaining belts. 200 rounds between them, Maybe enough for one more engagement if the ME-109s came back. Maybe not. They didn't discuss it. Didn't need to. They'd been protecting each other since they were kids in Chicago, and that instinct ran deeper than fear. Sanchez, isolated in the tail gunner position, fought his own battle with vertigo and fear. The tail section had taken several hits, and wind screamed through holes in the fuselage around him. His position swayed more violently than the rest of the aircraft with every maneuver, and he could see pieces of the tail's skin flapping loose, threatening to tear away completely. He'd thrown up twice into his oxygen mask, had to clear it quickly to avoid suffocating, and now his mouth tasted like bile and blood. But he stayed at his guns, stayed watching their 6 o'clock position, because that's where the next attack would come from if it came. But it was Mitchell's fight that became the focal point, the thing that unified them. As long as he was cranking, they all had hope. The moment he stopped, that hope would die. Hayes, from the cockpit, monitored it all. The captain was 30 years old, ancient by aircrew standards, and this was his 28th mission. 2 more, and he'd complete his tour, go home to his wife and daughter in Kansas, whom he hadn't seen in 11 months. But right now, home seemed like a concept from another lifetime. His entire world had narrowed to keeping this damaged bomber in the air, to nursing the wounded bird home despite the oil pressure dropping on number 1 engine, despite the sluggish response from the damaged control surfaces, despite everything screaming at him that they should bail out while they still had altitude. But bailing out meant leaving Mitchell to die alone at the gear crank. It meant abandoning Sullivan in the nose, Morrison in the turret, all of them scattered across the German countryside to be captured or worse. Hayes had lost crews before, had watched bombers explode or spiral into fatal dives. He'd carried the guilt of those losses through sleepless nights and anxiety-soaked days. He wouldn't add his own crew to that list, not while there was any chance at all. At the 90-minute mark, Mitchell's hands were bleeding inside his gloves. He could feel the warm wetness mixing with sweat and the cold air turning it tacky and painful. His shoulders had moved beyond burning into a numb, distant ache that he knew would be agony once he stopped. If he stopped. The pain had evolved through distinct phases during those 90 minutes. First came the burning, muscles protesting the repetitive motion and the resistance, then the shaking, his body's rebellion against continuing. After that, a dangerous numbness crept in, his nervous system attempting to protect itself by shutting down sensation. But Mitchell couldn't afford numbness. He needed to feel the crank, needed to know he was still turning it with enough force to make progress. So he focused on the pain, used it as an anchor to consciousness. Each rotation brought fresh agony as blisters burst and reformed, as ligaments stretched beyond their normal range, as bones ground against damaged tendons. He counted the rotations, lost count, started again. Numbers had always been his refuge, his way of making sense of chaos. 100 rotations, 200, 500. The numbers blurred together. Webb watched helplessly, his own hands clenched into fists, as if he could somehow share the burden through sympathetic tension. The radio operator had seen men die in this war, had seen bodies torn apart by shrapnel and fire. But watching Mitchell's slow destruction was somehow worse because it was voluntary. The Navigator was choosing this suffering, embracing it, because the alternative was death for all of them. "Talk to me, Mitch," Webb said quietly, not keying the intercom. "Stay with me here." Mitchell's lips moved, but no sound came out at first. His throat was raw from the cold air and heavy breathing. Finally, in a voice like gravel, "Tell me about Ohio. Tell me about your garage." So Webb talked. He described the building he'd found on the edge of Columbus, a former machine shop with good bones and plenty of space. He talked about the tools he'd buy, the cars he'd work on, the community he'd build. His voice painted a picture of a future that seemed impossibly distant from this freezing metal tomb crossing the German countryside. "Going to have a sign out front," Webb continued. "Webb's Motors. Simple, you know. Nothing fancy, just honest work and fair prices. Maybe hire some other vets, guys who know their way around engines. Could use a good bookkeeper too, someone to handle the numbers side while I focus on the mechanical." It was an invitation, though neither man acknowledged it directly. A lifeline being offered for a future that might never come. Mitchell heard it anyway, held onto it along with everything else that kept him moving. The image of a garage in Ohio, where he might someday total invoices with damaged hands, while Webb coaxed life back into tired engines. The aircraft shuddered through another pocket of turbulence. Mitchell's grip slipped, the crank handle spinning backward for half a rotation before he caught it again. The setback was minor, but devastating to his morale. Every backward rotation meant starting from a lower point, meant his last 100 turns had been partially undone. "Still with us, Mitchell?" Hayes's voice on the intercom, tight with concern. Mitchell couldn't answer. He was crying now, tears freezing on his cheeks, his breath coming in ragged sobs, but his arms kept moving. That was what mattered. His body was breaking down, his mind fragmenting, but the circular motion continued. Webb pressed the intercom button for him. "He's still cranking, Captain. Never stopped." "Outstanding," Hayes replied, and there was emotion in his voice that the professional pilot rarely showed. "We're over friendly territory now. Home stretch, boys. Home stretch." The words should have been encouraging, but Mitchell knew better. They still had at least an hour of flight time, maybe more if Hayes had to divert around weather or find a suitable emergency field. An hour was an eternity when every second felt like drowning in fire. His vision was tunneling now, darkness creeping in from the edges. He recognized the symptoms of shock, his body beginning to shut down non-essential systems to preserve core functions. But his arms weren't non-essential, they were everything. He fought to stay conscious, bit down on his tongue until he tasted blood, used the sharp pain to keep the darkness at bay. The crank mechanism made a grinding sound that hadn't been there before. Something in the damaged system was beginning to fail completely, adding even more resistance. What had been nearly impossible was now entering the realm of superhuman. Mitchell felt something tear in his left shoulder, heard the wet pop of stressed tissue giving way. The pain was blinding, absolute, and he screamed into the oxygen mask, the sound muffled and terrible. "Mitch!" Webb moved forward, reaching for the crank to take over. "No!" Mitchell forced the word out through gritted teeth. "Can't stop. Can't." He was right. If they stopped now, if they lost the tension in the cables, they might never get it back. The gear was probably 3/4 extended, maybe more, but 3/4 wasn't enough. It had to lock fully, or they'd crash anyway. So he cranked with a torn shoulder, feeling tendons grind and separate with each rotation. His left arm was barely functional now, mostly dead weight that his right arm had to compensate for. He adjusted his grip, using his body weight to help push the crank through its rotation, turning the motion into a full-body exercise that drew on reserves he didn't know he had. 2 hours in. The aircraft crossed into Allied-controlled airspace. Webb received confirmation that they had clearance for an emergency landing at a forward base in Belgium. The news should have been encouraging, but Mitchell knew the worst was still ahead. Hayes would need those landing gear locked down perfectly. A partial deployment would be worse than nothing, could catch on the runway and flip the entire aircraft. The Navigator's world had shrunk to the size of the crank handle. Nothing else existed. Not the war, not the mission, not even his own survival. Just the next rotation, and the one after that. His consciousness had separated from his body, floating somewhere above the pain, occasionally checking in to confirm that yes, the motion was continuing, yes, he was still alive. In this dissociated state, memories surfaced unbidden. His mother teaching him to ride a bicycle, running alongside until he found his balance. His father showing him how to balance a checkbook, the quiet pride when Mitchell grasped the concept immediately. His high school sweetheart, Mary, kissing him goodbye at the train station when he left for the war, tears streaming down her face as she made him promise to come home. He'd promised. He intended to keep that promise. But he was beginning to understand that the man who came home might not be the one she'd said goodbye to. The war was taking pieces of him, leaving scars that went deeper than damaged hands and torn shoulders. How did you explain to someone who hadn't been here what it felt like to choose suffering, to embrace pain as a path to survival? Webb's voice cut through his fugue. "Mitch, you're bleeding through your gloves. I can see it." Mitchell looked down at his hands, surprised by the amount of blood. His gloves were soaked, dark stains spreading across the heavy leather. He should have felt something about this, horror or fear. But he felt nothing. Just a distant acknowledgement that yes, this was bad, and a determination to keep going anyway. "Don't care," he managed to say. "Keep going." "You're going to lose your hands, Mitch. You need to stop." Lose hands or lose life, Mitchell forced out between rotations. Easy choice. It wasn't, actually. The calculation was more complex than that. But Mitchell had made his decision 90 minutes ago, and he was committed now. Stopping would mean all of this suffering had been for nothing. Stopping would mean failing his crew. Stopping would mean accepting defeat, and something fundamental in James Mitchell's character refused to accept defeat. The radio crackled with chatter from the base in Belgium. They were preparing for the emergency landing, clearing the runway, positioning fire trucks and ambulances. The whole base was mobilizing to save Lucky Seven's crew. Mitchell heard it distantly, understanding that his suffering had become visible, that people were watching and waiting to see if he could finish what he'd started. 2 hours and 15 minutes. His right arm was beginning to fail now too. The muscles were cramping, seizing up in protest of the continuous exertion. He couldn't straighten his fingers anymore. They were locked in a claw grip around the crank handle. His shoulders, both of them now, felt like they were full of broken glass. Morrison's voice came through. "Temp gauge on number 1 is climbing now. We might lose both engines before landing." Just another problem in a list that seemed endless. Mitchell cranked. What else could he do? His entire existence had been reduced to this single action, repeated until it became meditation, prayer, penance. The co-pilot, Lieutenant Anderson, whom Mitchell barely knew because the young man rarely spoke, made a suggestion over the intercom. "Skipper, we could try for a belly landing. Might be safer than risking gear failure on touchdown." Hayes rejected it immediately. "Mitchell's been cranking for over 2 hours. We're landing on wheels, or we're not landing at all." The captain's loyalty was absolute, his refusal to abandon Mitchell's effort complete. It should have felt good, that vote of confidence. Instead, it just added more weight to the Navigator's burden. Now he was cranking not just for survival, but for Hayes's faith in him, for the captain's refusal to consider alternatives. 2 hours and 30 minutes. The bleeding had slowed, or maybe he'd just run out of blood to lose from his hands. Either way, the wetness was less now, though the pain had reached levels he hadn't thought possible. Every nerve ending in his arms and shoulders was screaming. His body was producing so much adrenaline that he was shaking violently even as he cranked, his teeth chattering, his breath coming in short gasps. "How much longer?" he asked Webb, not sure if the words came out audibly. The radio operator understood anyway. 20 minutes to the field. Maybe 25. An eternity. A lifetime. Mitchell cranked. Webb stayed with him the entire time, a steady presence in the cramped radio room. The sergeant talked, sharing stories about his family in Ohio, about the girl he planned to marry when he got home, about the garage he wanted to open where he'd fix cars and motorcycles. Mitchell didn't respond, couldn't respond, but the voice was an anchor keeping him tethered to consciousness. Hayes's voice on the intercom pulled Mitchell back from the edge. "We're on final approach." "Mitchell, I need a status check." Webb pressed the intercom button for him. "Still cranking, Captain. He hasn't stopped once." There was emotion in Hayes's response, carefully controlled but unmistakable. "Outstanding, Lieutenant. Just a little longer. Gear indicators show we're almost there." Almost there. The words cycled through Mitchell's brain like a mantra. Almost there. Almost home. Just keep cranking. One more rotation, and another, and another. 2 hours and 45 minutes. The gear indicator lights in the cockpit flickered. Hayes held his breath, watching them. One light went green, then the second, then the third. "Gear down and locked. Mitchell, you did it. You can stop." But Mitchell couldn't stop. His body had been cranking for so long that it didn't remember how to do anything else. His arms kept moving, even as Webb gently pulled him away from the mechanism, even as the sergeant wrapped him in a blanket and tried to warm his frozen, bleeding hands. The B-17 touched down hard on the Belgian airfield, its damaged airframe groaning but holding together. Hayes kept it straight despite the crosswind, despite the blown tire on the left main gear, despite everything that had gone wrong. The bomber rolled to a stop at the end of the runway, smoke pouring from the No. 2 engine, hydraulic fluid dripping from a dozen holes in the fuselage. The crew helped Mitchell out of the aircraft. His legs wouldn't support him. His arms hung useless at his sides. His hands were wrapped in blood-soaked bandages that medics had applied while he was still semi-conscious. But he was alive. They were all alive. The base commander came out personally to meet them, surveying the damage to the B-17 with professional appreciation for the fact that it had made it home at all. When Hayes explained what Mitchell had done, cranking the landing gear manually for nearly 3 hours under fire and in sub-freezing temperatures, the commander's weathered face softened. "That's beyond the call of duty, Lieutenant," he said quietly, looking at Mitchell, who could barely keep his eyes open. "Way beyond." Mitchell spent 3 weeks in the base hospital. The damage to his hands required surgery to repair torn ligaments and remove bone fragments from where he'd gripped the crank so hard his own strength had injured him. The frostbite took 2 of his fingers down to the first knuckle, though the doctors managed to save the rest. His shoulders would ache for the rest of his life, a permanent reminder of those 3 hours over Germany. The hospital was a converted manor house, its elegant rooms now filled with metal beds and the smell of antiseptic. Mitchell shared a ward with 15 other wounded airmen, men who'd survived burning aircraft and crash landings, who'd taken shrapnel and bullets, who'd frozen at altitude and broken bones in emergency bailouts. Each had his own story of survival, his own scars to carry home. The first week was the worst. The pain medications made Mitchell drift in and out of consciousness, and when he was awake, phantom sensations tormented him. He could still feel the crank in his hands, could still feel his arms making that endless circular motion. Sometimes he woke in the night, his arms twitching, trying to turn a crank that wasn't there. The nurses would find him sitting up in bed, tears streaming down his face, hands reaching for something invisible. A psychologist came to see him on the 4th day. Captain Reynolds was older, maybe 50, with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and the bearing of someone who'd seen enough broken men to know how to talk to them. He sat beside Mitchell's bed and didn't ask the Navigator to talk about the mission. Instead, he asked about Pennsylvania, about Mitchell's family, about what he planned to do after the war. "I used to think I'd go into my father's accounting business," Mitchell said, his voice rough from disuse. "Numbers made sense to me. Clean, logical, predictable." "Used to think?" Reynolds prompted gently. Mitchell looked at his bandaged hands. "Nothing feels predictable anymore. How do you go back to adding columns of figures when you've seen what we've seen? When you know what people are capable of, both the terrible and the incredible?" Reynolds nodded slowly. That's the question you'll all be asking yourselves for the rest of your lives. The ones who went to war and came back changed. My advice? Don't try to be who you were before. That man doesn't exist anymore. Figure out who you are now and build from there. The words stayed with Mitchell through the long days of recovery. He watched his hands heal slowly, watched as the doctors unwrapped the bandages to reveal scarred, stiffened fingers that would never regain their full dexterity. He practiced gripping a pencil, struggled to write his name in shaky letters that bore no resemblance to his former precise hand. In the second week, Sullivan came to visit. The bombardier brought contraband chocolate and a flask of bourbon he'd liberated from somewhere. They sat together in the hospital's small courtyard, watching spring arrive in England with tentative blooms and warming air. "Morrison sends his regards," Sullivan said, offering Mitchell a cigarette. "Said to tell you the gear mechanism fought you harder than it should have. He examined the wreckage before they scrapped Lucky 7. Cable was damaged in the same flak burst that got our hydraulics. You weren't just fighting the normal resistance, you were fighting compromised equipment." Mitchell absorbed this information silently. It should have made him feel better, knowing that the difficulty hadn't been in his head, that the task had been even harder than designed. Instead, it just made him tired. "Hayes is putting you in for the Distinguished Flying Cross," Sullivan continued, "probably the Silver Star. You saved our lives, Mitch, all of us. You all saved mine too," Mitchell replied quietly. "If Hayes hadn't kept us in the air, if Morrison hadn't kept that engine from exploding, if any one of you had given up, we'd all be dead. I just did my part. Your part was 3 hours of hell that would have broken most men in the first 30 minutes. Sullivan's voice was fierce. "Don't diminish what you did. We all saw it. We all know what it cost you." And when he was well enough to receive visitors, the entire crew of Lucky 7 came to see him. They brought with them a piece of the manual landing gear crank, cut from the aircraft before it was scrapped for parts. Someone had engraved it with a simple inscription, "L.T.J. Mitchell, March 1945. He never stopped." The gesture broke something inside Mitchell that had been holding firm through all the pain and fear and uncertainty. He looked at these 6 men who'd become his brothers, who'd trusted him with their lives, and whom he'd trusted with his, and felt tears he'd been holding back for weeks finally break free. They crowded around his bed, these young men who'd seen too much death, and for a moment they were just kids again, laughing and joking and grateful to be alive. Webb produced a camera and convinced a nurse to take their picture. In that photograph, which Mitchell would keep for the rest of his life, 7 young men smile with the fierce joy of survival. Only if you looked closely could you see the shadows in their eyes, the knowledge of how close they'd come to never making it home. Hayes sat beside the hospital bed, his usual commander's bearing softened by genuine emotion. "They're writing you up for a medal," he said. "Distinguished Flying Cross at minimum, maybe more. What you did up there, I've never seen anything like it." Mitchell looked at his bandaged hands, thinking about those 3 hours that existed in his memory as both an eternity and an instant. He thought about Webb's steady presence, about the voices of the crew over the intercom, about the cold and the pain and the grinding of gears that he still heard sometimes when he closed his eyes. "I just did what needed doing," he said finally. "Same as all of you. Same as everyone in this war." But they all knew it was more than that. Hayes leaned forward, his voice dropping to just above a whisper. "Anderson wanted to go for a belly landing. Morrison thought we should bail out while we still had altitude. Even I started considering alternatives. But then I'd think about you back there, bleeding and broken but still cranking, and I couldn't give up. You kept us all going, Mitch, not just the aircraft. Us." The captain pulled something from his pocket, a small notebook Mitchell recognized as his own, his navigation log, which he'd left behind when he went to the gear crank. Hayes opened it to a page where someone had written in shaky handwriting, "If I don't make it, tell Mary I love her. Tell my parents I'm sorry I won't be coming home. Tell them it was worth it." Mitchell didn't remember writing that. Must have been in the first few minutes, when he still thought he might pass out or worse. The words looked alien now, like they'd been written by someone else. Webb found it when we were cleaning out the aircraft, Hayes explained. He wanted me to see it, wanted me to understand what you were thinking about back there. You were ready to die for us, Mitch. You made your peace with it and cranked anyway. I wasn't ready, Mitchell corrected quietly. I was terrified. I just didn't see another option. That's what makes it brave, Hayes said. Courage isn't the absence of fear. It's acting despite it. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a colonel Mitchell didn't recognize. The officer introduced himself as Colonel Barnes from 8th Air Force Headquarters. He'd come to take Mitchell's statement for the medal citation, but he seemed more interested in understanding what had happened from a technical perspective. The engineering team examined the wreckage of your aircraft, Barnes explained, pulling up a chair. The damage to the hydraulic system was catastrophic. By their calculations, manual deployment of the landing gear should have been impossible given the cable damage and the gear's weight. They estimate you were working against approximately 3 times the normal resistance. Mitchell absorbed this information numbly. It explained why it had been so difficult, why his body had broken down so completely. But it also raised questions he didn't want to consider. If it should have been impossible, how had he done it? They also want to redesign the manual backup system based on your experience, Barnes continued. Add a second crew position for the crank. Maybe incorporate a ratchet mechanism to prevent backward rotation. Your ordeal might save other crews in the future. The thought should have been comforting, but Mitchell just felt tired. He'd become data, a case study in human endurance that would be analyzed and incorporated into future aircraft designs. The personal cost, the scars he'd carry, reduced to engineering specifications and load calculations. After Barnes left, the crew filtered back in one by one. They'd been waiting outside, giving the officers their time with Mitchell, but unwilling to go far. These bonds forged in combat were stronger than blood, stranger than friendship. They were 7 men who'd faced death together and chosen to fight for each other's survival. Sanchez brought news that Lucky 7 had been officially declared unsalvageable. The aircraft that had carried them through 28 missions was being stripped for parts, its serial number retired. There was a moment of silence for the bomber, a recognition that it had been more than just metal and rivets. It had been their home in the sky, their protector, their lucky charm that had run out of luck. They're forming new crews, Frank Kowalski said. Assigning us to different bombers for the last few missions of the war won't be the same. Nothing will be the same, Tommy added quietly. His brother nodded agreement. Morrison had brought something with him, a folder full of papers that he spread across Mitchell's hospital bed. Calculations, he explained, working through the physics of what Mitchell had accomplished. The engineer couldn't let it go, couldn't stop analyzing how a human body had achieved something the numbers said shouldn't be possible. You were burning approximately 1,500 calories per hour, Morrison explained, pointing to his figures. Your core temperature dropped by at least 3 degrees. The force required for each rotation exceeded 200 pounds at peak resistance. By any reasonable measure, you should have suffered complete muscle failure after 60 minutes maximum. So how did I do it for 3 hours? Mitchell asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted the answer. Morrison shook his head. I don't know. The math doesn't work. You shouldn't have been able to, but you did. He paused, looking uncomfortable. I think you broke yourself doing it, not just your hands and shoulders, something deeper. The medical staff is worried about long-term damage to your nervous system, possible organ stress from the sustained shock state. The words hung heavy in the air. Mitchell had saved them all, but the price might be higher than anyone had initially thought. Not just shortened fingers and scarred palms, but deeper wounds that wouldn't show on X-rays. Webb changed the subject, sensing Mitchell's growing distress. You hear they're talking about ending the war soon? Germans are surrendering left and right. We might all be going home. Home. The word had lost some of its luster. Mitchell tried to imagine returning to Pennsylvania, to Mary, to his parents and the life he'd left behind, but that life belonged to a different person. The man in this hospital bed, with his ruined hands and traumatized body, didn't fit into those old patterns anymore. The crew stayed for hours, sprawled around the hospital ward, in various chairs and positions, sharing stories and silence in equal measure. They'd become experts at this during their months together, the comfortable camaraderie of men who'd learned to communicate without always needing words. As evening approached and visiting hours ended, they prepared to leave reluctantly. Hayes was the last to go, pausing at the door to look back at Mitchell. "You know what the hardest part was?" the captain said. "Watching those gear indicator lights and knowing that if they didn't go green, all your suffering would be for nothing. The pressure of that, knowing you were back there destroying yourself based on faith that I could get us down safely. I'll carry that weight the rest of my life." "We all made it," Mitchell replied. "That's what matters." Hayes nodded slowly. "Get some rest, Lieutenant. We'll see you tomorrow." Dead, alone in the darkening ward, Mitchell lay back against his pillows and tried to process everything that had happened, the mission, the cranking, the aftermath. His hands throbbed despite the medication. His shoulders ached with a deep, persistent pain that the doctors said might never fully fade. But he was alive. They were all alive. A nurse came by to check his vitals, a young woman named Catherine, who'd been taking care of him since his arrival. She had a kind face and gentle hands, and she never asked questions about what had happened. She just did her job with quiet competence. "You had more visitors today than anyone else on the ward," she observed while checking his pulse. "Must be quite the story behind it." "Just a crew taking care of their own," Mitchell said. She smiled slightly. "I've seen a lot of crews come through here. This is different. They look at you like you walked through fire for them." "I guess I did," Mitchell admitted, though it was more like cold than fire. That night his dreams were vivid and disturbing. He was back in the radio room, cranking endlessly while the aircraft fell apart around him. But in the dream, the gear never locked, the indicator lights never went green. He cranked forever through a twilight that never resolved into either safety or destruction. He woke gasping, his arms moving in that circular motion before he fully regained consciousness. Catherine was there, having heard his distressed sounds. She gently stilled his arms, talking in soothing tones until his breathing normalized. "The mind takes longer to heal than the body sometimes," she said softly. "Give it time." But time felt like another enemy to overcome, another endless crank that had to be turned rotation by rotation until some distant future when he might feel whole again. The crew of Lucky 7 flew 2 more missions before the war in Europe ended. Mitchell wasn't with them, grounded by his injuries and the slow process of rehabilitation. He spent VE Day in England, his hands still wrapped but healing, watching the celebrations with a quiet satisfaction that had nothing to do with victory parades or champagne. The base erupted in celebration on May 8th. Men who'd lived under the constant shadow of death for months or years suddenly faced a future where they might actually survive. The drinking started early and continued late into the night. Bonfires burned on the airfield, unauthorized but tolerated. Music played from every barracks. Couples danced in the streets of nearby towns. Mitchell watched it all from his wheelchair outside the hospital. The doctors had fitted him with the chair after his first attempt to walk had ended with him collapsing from the pain in his shoulders. The torn ligaments were healing, but slowly, and bearing his own weight stressed them too much, so he sat and observed, a spectator to joy he couldn't quite feel. Sullivan found him on a bench outside the base hospital, away from the crowds. The bombardier carried 2 bottles of beer and a complicated expression. He sat down without speaking, and the two men watched the sunset paint the English countryside in shades of orange and gold that seemed impossible after so many years of smoke and fire. "It's over," Sullivan said finally. "We won. We actually won." "Yeah," Mitchell agreed, his voice flat. "You don't sound happy about it." Mitchell considered his response carefully. "I am. I'm glad it's over. Glad no more crews have to die, but I keep thinking about the ones who didn't make it to see this day. The guys we lost. Seems wrong to celebrate when so many didn't get to." Sullivan nodded slowly, understanding the survivor's guilt that Mitchell couldn't quite articulate. The bombardier had his own ghosts, planes he'd watched go down, friends who'd died while he lived. "You know what Webb told me," Sullivan said eventually, "about that day over Berlin?" Mitchell shook his head. "He said watching you crank that gear for 3 hours, never stopping, never quitting. It changed something in him. Said if you could do that, he could do anything. We all felt it." Sullivan paused, struggling with words. "You gave us something to believe in when we needed it most." Mitchell didn't know how to respond to that. He'd never thought of himself as particularly brave or inspiring. He'd just been terrified of dying in a ball of flame on a German runway, so he'd kept cranking. But maybe that was enough. Maybe that's all courage ever was, being terrified and doing what needed doing anyway. The celebration continued around them, but in their quiet corner, the two men sat with their memories and their scars. Eventually Sullivan spoke again. "I'm scared to go home," he admitted. "My family, they think I'm still the same kid who left Brooklyn in '43. How do I tell them I'm not? How do I explain what we've seen, what we've done?" "You don't," Mitchell said quietly. "You can't. They weren't there. They won't understand, no matter how much you explain. You just have to find a way to live with the difference between who you were and who you are now. Is that what you're going to do?" Mitchell looked at his bandaged hands, thought about Mary waiting for him back in Pennsylvania. "I'm going to try. Don't know what else to do." The weeks that followed VE Day were strange. A liminal space between war and peace, where nobody quite knew what to do with themselves. The bomber crews were being demobilized, sent home in waves based on points calculated from missions flown and time served. Mitchell's injuries earned him priority, but he wasn't in any hurry. Going home meant facing the reality of his new limitations, meant trying to rebuild a life with hands that didn't work right and shoulders that screamed with every movement. The medal ceremony happened on a Tuesday morning in late May. Colonel Barnes presented Mitchell with the Distinguished Flying Cross in a small ceremony attended by his crew and a handful of officers. The citation read in part, "For extraordinary achievement while participating in aerial flight under extremely hazardous conditions. Lieutenant Mitchell's exceptional courage and determination in manually deploying the landing gear for nearly 3 hours while under enemy fire demonstrated the highest traditions of military service and reflects great credit upon himself and the United States Army Air Forces." The words sounded grand, but felt hollow. Mitchell accepted the medal with his ruined hands, managed a salute that sent pain shooting through his shoulders, and tried to feel something other than tired. Hayes pinned the medal to his uniform, and there were photographs that Mitchell never wanted to see because he knew what his face would show. Not pride or satisfaction, but the haunted look of someone who'd paid too high a price for survival. After the ceremony, Webb pulled Mitchell aside. The radio operator had news. His discharge papers had come through. He was going home in 3 days, back to Ohio, and the garage he'd dreamed about during those long hours over Berlin. "Come with me," Webb said suddenly. "To Columbus. You said your father's in accounting, right? You know numbers. I need someone I can trust to help run the business side while I handle the mechanical work. We'd be partners." Mitchell was surprised by the offer, by the genuine hope in Webb's voice. "I don't know anything about running a garage." "You know how to not quit when things get hard," Webb countered. "That's more important than knowing about cars." We could figure out the rest together. It was tempting, the idea of starting fresh somewhere new, away from the expectations and memories of home. But Mitchell had Mary waiting for him, had made promises he intended to keep. "I need to go back to Pennsylvania first," he said. "Need to see if I can make things work there. But if it doesn't, if I can't find my place, I'll take you up on it." Webb nodded, understanding. "Offer stands. Any time. You helped me survive the worst day of my life. Least I can do is give you a place to land if you need it." They shook hands carefully, Mitchell wincing at the pressure on his healing fingers. It was goodbye for now, though both hoped not forever. The bonds forged in combat didn't break easily, even when separated by distance and time. Morrison left next, then the Kowalski brothers together, as they'd done everything. Sanchez and Sullivan went on the same transport ship. Hayes was the last, staying until his entire crew had been processed and sent home. The captain visited Mitchell one final time before his own departure. "I've been flying for 8 years, Hayes said. "Trained more crews than I can count. Lost more good men than I want to remember. But that crew, our crew, you 7 men, were the finest I ever had the privilege to command. What we did together, what you did that day over Berlin, I'll carry that with me always." "We just did our jobs," Mitchell replied, though he knew it was more than that. "No," Hayes corrected gently. "We were extraordinary, and you, Lieutenant, you were the best of us. Don't ever forget that." After Hayes left, Mitchell was alone in a way he hadn't been since before the war. No crew to rely on, no mission to fly, no external purpose to give structure to his days. Just a damaged young man trying to figure out how to live in a world at peace when he'd been forged in a world at war. His own discharge came in early June. The military was efficient at processing wounded personnel, eager to make room for the next wave of casualties. Mitchell received his papers, his final pay, a ticket home on a hospital ship departing Southampton, and a medical file 3 inches thick that detailed every injury and recommended long-term treatment. The voyage home was rough, the Atlantic living up to its reputation even in summer. Mitchell spent most of it below decks, his damaged shoulders unable to handle the ship's rolling motion without severe pain. He shared a berth with other wounded men, swapped stories and silence, counted down the days until they reached New York. When they finally saw the Statue of Liberty rising from the harbor, the entire ship erupted in cheers. Men who'd fought and bled for their country were coming home at last. Mitchell felt the emotion of it, the relief and gratitude and hope. But underneath ran a current of anxiety he couldn't shake. Who would he be in this America that had moved on without him? How did you come home from war when war had made you someone new? The truth was more complicated than that, though Mitchell would spend years unpacking it. In the immediate aftermath, back on that hospital bed with his crew gathered around him, he'd felt something shift inside. Not pride, exactly. More like an understanding that he'd found something in himself he hadn't known existed. Not strength, because his strength had failed him repeatedly during those 3 hours. Not courage, because courage implied a choice. And there had been no choice to make. What he'd found was stubbornness, a fundamental bone-deep refusal to accept defeat. It wasn't noble or heroic. It was just his nature, revealed under pressure. Like coal compressed into diamond, the experience had shown him what he was made of at his core. In the weeks that followed, as spring turned to summer and the war in Europe ground toward its conclusion, Mitchell began the slow process of rehabilitation. Physical therapy sessions in the hospital's converted ballroom, where men with missing limbs and shattered bodies worked to reclaim what they could of their former selves. Mitchell's injuries were relatively minor by comparison, but they were his, and they changed him. His hands would never fully recover. The surgeons had done what they could, but some damage couldn't be repaired. His grip strength was diminished, fine motor control compromised. Simple tasks he'd never thought about before, buttoning a shirt, tying shoelaces, holding a coffee cup, required concentration and effort. The first time he tried to write a letter home, his handwriting was so shaky he couldn't read it himself. He crumpled the paper in frustration, then cried at the pain that simple action caused his stiffened fingers. An occupational therapist named Sarah worked with him daily. She was British, from London, and had her own war stories, though she rarely shared them. She taught him adaptive techniques, ways to work around his limitations. She was patient when he was frustrated, firm when he wanted to give up, and quietly encouraging when he made progress. "You're trying to force your hands to work the way they used to," she observed one afternoon, as Mitchell struggled with the exercise involving small blocks. "That's not going to happen. You need to learn to work with what you have now, not mourn what you've lost." It was good advice that extended beyond his hands. The Mitchell who'd climbed into Lucky 7 that March morning didn't exist anymore. That man had been left somewhere over Berlin, replaced by someone harder, more aware of his own mortality, carrying scars both visible and hidden. Years later, when Mitchell was an old man with grandchildren who asked about the scars on his hands and why his shoulders always seemed to hurt, he would tell them about the day the hydraulics failed over Berlin. He would describe the cold and the fear and the endless grinding of that gear mechanism. He would talk about his crew, about Hayes keeping that crippled bomber in the air, about Webb's steady presence, about all of them fighting their own battles to bring each other home. But he would also tell them about coming home, about the challenges that nobody talked about in the victory parades and newsreels. About nights waking up with his arms moving in that circular motion, phantom pain shooting through healed injuries. About the guilt of surviving when so many hadn't. About learning to live with himself after seeing what war could do to human beings. His granddaughter Emily, sharp-eyed even at 8 years old, asked him once if he had nightmares. Mitchell considered lying, considered protecting her from that knowledge, but she deserved honesty. "Sometimes," he admitted. "Not as much as I used to, but sometimes I'm back in that radio room, and my arms are so tired I can't feel them anymore, and I'm sure I'm going to die there. And then I wake up in bed next to your grandmother, and I remember that I made it home." "Were you scared?" Emily asked. "Terrified, every second of those 3 hours. But you didn't stop." "No," Mitchell agreed. "I didn't stop." He never told his grandchildren about the months after returning home, when the nightmares were at their worst, when he couldn't hold down a job because his hands shook too badly, when he drank too much trying to quiet the memories, when his new bride, the girl he'd loved since high school, found him on the back porch at 3 a.m, weeping for reasons he couldn't articulate. She'd sat with him without speaking, her hand on his shoulder, until dawn broke over the Pennsylvania hills. And in the morning, she'd called the Veterans Administration and found him a support group for returned airmen. Men who understood what it was like to come home from war to a country that celebrated victory but didn't know what to do with the broken men who'd won it. In that church basement in Pittsburgh, sitting in a circle of folding chairs with 11 other former aircrew members, Mitchell found something he'd been missing since leaving England: understanding. These men knew about the nightmares, the phantom pains, the guilt and the fear. They knew about the sudden sounds that sent your heart racing. They knew about the disconnect between the man you'd been and the man you'd become. A former tail gunner named Peterson, who'd lost an arm over France, spoke words that Mitchell would never forget. "We did what we had to do. We saw what we saw. We can't change that. All we can do is figure out how to live with it and try to build something good with the time we've got left." It became Mitchell's mission. Not to forget what had happened or to pretend the scars didn't exist, but to build something meaningful from the life he'd been given. He went back to school on the GI Bill, got his teaching certificate, and found his calling working with young people. Mathematics came easily to him still, despite his damaged hands, and he discovered he had a gift for making complex concepts accessible. His students never knew their quiet math teacher had hand-cranked landing gear for 3 hours under fire. They didn't know about the distinguished flying cross in his desk drawer or the piece of the gear crank on his mantel at home. They just knew Mr. Mitchell was patient, that he believed in them even when they didn't believe in themselves, that he never gave up on anyone. Only once did his past become relevant in the classroom. A student named David Chen, struggling with a difficult problem set, threw his pencil down in frustration. "This is impossible," he declared. "Nobody could do this." Mitchell had picked up the pencil, handed it back. "Impossible is a word people use before they find a way," he said quietly. "Keep working. Try a different approach. Don't give up." Something in his tone made David look up, really look at his teacher. He noticed for the first time the scarred hands, the stiff way Mr. Mitchell moved his shoulders. The student picked up his pencil and went back to work. After class, David approached Mitchell's desk. "What happened to your hands, sir?" Mitchell could have deflected, could have given a vague answer. Instead, he told David about Lucky 7. Not the whole story, just enough. About the landing gear and the crank and the 3 hours that seemed to last forever. "You cranked it the whole time?" David asked, amazed. "Your hands got like that and you didn't stop?" "Stopping wasn't an option," Mitchell explained. "My crew needed me. So I did what needed doing." David thought about this. "That's why you tell us not to give up." "Because you didn't." "That's part of it," Mitchell agreed. "But more than that, I learned that what seems impossible often isn't. It's just hard. And hard things are worth doing, especially when others are depending on you." But what he remembered most vividly, what stayed with him through all the decades that followed, wasn't the pain or the fear. It was the simple act of not stopping, of turning that crank one more time, and then one more time after that, and then again, of reducing the entire war, with all its complexity and horror and moral weight, down to a single circular motion that he could control. In a conflict that killed millions and reshaped the world, one young navigator's 3-hour fight with a manual gear crank might seem insignificant. But for the 7 men aboard Lucky 7 that day, it meant everything. It meant the difference between death and life, between a fiery crash and a rough but survivable landing. It meant they all went home. Mitchell never talked much about the medal he received, kept it in a drawer where he rarely looked at it. But that piece of the gear crank, with its simple engraving, held a place of honor in his home until the day he died. Because it represented something more important than recognition or glory. It represented the knowledge that when it mattered most, when everything was on the line and his body was breaking down and there was no guarantee any of it would matter, he had found the strength to keep going. That's the legacy of James Mitchell and thousands of others like him who fought in the Second World War. Not just their victories or their sacrifices, but their stubborn, relentless refusal to quit. Their understanding that sometimes survival is a matter of one more rotation, one more step, one more breath, and then another and another, until somehow, impossibly, you make it home. The manual landing gear crank from Lucky 7 eventually made its way to a military museum, where it sits today with its worn metal and faded engraving. Visitors pass by it, most not understanding its significance. But occasionally someone stops, reads the inscription, and begins to grasp what it represents. 3 hours of continuous physical effort under fire. 3 hours that saved 7 lives. 3 hours that showed what the human spirit is capable of when there's no other choice but to endure. When the hydraulics failed over Berlin, Lieutenant James Mitchell faced a choice. He could have given up, passed the burden to someone else, accepted the likely outcome. Instead, he gripped that crank and turned it for 3 hours straight. He bled for it, he sacrificed pieces of himself for it, and in doing so, he ensured that his brothers in arms would see another dawn. That's not just a war story. That's a story about what we're capable of when we refuse to surrender to circumstances, when we find strength we didn't know we had, when we push past every limit and keep going anyway. It's a reminder that sometimes the most heroic thing you can do isn't dramatic or glorious. Sometimes it's just continuing to turn the crank, one rotation at a time until the job is done. The bomber Lucky 7 was eventually scrapped, its aluminum recycled into new aircraft that would serve in different conflicts. The men who flew in it scattered to the winds, returning to civilian lives where they became teachers and mechanics, salesmen and fathers, ordinary people who had done extraordinary things. But they never forgot those 3 hours over Berlin, when their navigator showed them what true determination looked like. James Mitchell returned to his home in Pennsylvania, married his childhood sweetheart, raised 3 children, and worked as a high school mathematics teacher for 35 years. His students never knew that the quiet man teaching them algebra had once hand-cranked landing gear for 3 hours while under enemy fire. He didn't think it was important for them to know. But his family knew. His crew knew. And the 7 men who owed their lives to his refusal to quit carried that knowledge with them always. In the end, that's what matters most. Not the medals or the recognition, but the knowledge that when it counted, when lives hung in the balance, one man found the strength to do what seemed impossible. He turned that crank until his hands bled and his shoulders screamed and his body begged him to stop. And he kept turning it anyway because his brothers needed him to, because there was no other option, because that's what you do when the hydraulics fail over Berlin and everyone's counting on you to bring them home. That's the story worth remembering. That's the legacy worth preserving. One navigator, one manual crank, 3 hours that changed everything. 3 hours that proved what we're capable of when we absolutely refuse to quit.